Thank y'all. I can't think of a better way to end what has already been an incredible conference with this absolutely exceptional collection of our water warriors who are fully engaged in moving Texas water forward. And I don't know how we managed to do it, Lauren. You're a magic woman, but we managed to get Evan Smith out of semi-retirement. Evan recently stepped down as CEO of the Texas Tribune after 13 years at the helm, and he has agreed to moderate this panel. And I know he's going to ask some really tough and insightful questions, and we're going to get some great scoop on the 88th legislative session. So that's what I'm here for, the great scoop. Although knowing him, I'm quite confident that this is merely a beginning of his new chapter of his life. Apparently, we're working outside of Texas now, correct? Well, you've done a lot of good at the Tribune, and we're very happy to see you. And good luck with all the new endeavors. And with that, ask them the really, really hard questions about water. With that, thank y'all.
Will do. Chair, thank you very much. Everybody, good morning. Thanks so much for being here. It's fun to be back at the conference. I'm pleased to introduce the distinguished guests who joined us on stage. We're going to have a great conversation about water in the 88th session. We're going to talk for about 2/3 of the hour, and then we're going to open up the floor for your questions, which I know will be excellent, and we'll wrap at the top of the hour. On the end is Cody Harris, Republican of Palestine, in his third term representing House District 8. We do not yet know what committees he'll serve on in the 88th session. He and his fellow House members will know soon. The last time he was Vice Chair of the Natural Resources Committee and sat on the Calendars Committee along with Senator Perry. He was also co-chair of the Joint SWIFT Advisory Committee. Next to Representative Harris is Chairman Tracy King, Democrat of Batesville, elected to represent House District 80 all the way back in 2004. In the 87th session, he chaired the Natural Resources Committee, yes, a Democratic chair. Just want to point that out, and served on the Energy Resources Committee. Earlier this month, it was announced that he would chair the first ever Texas House Water Caucus, whose goal is to educate members about water security issues. We'll talk about that today. On my left, Charles Perry, Republican of Lubbock, elected to represent his Senate district in a special election in 2014 after 2 terms in the Texas House. In the 88th session, we do know the Senate committees. He chairs the Water, Agriculture, and Rural Affairs Committee, sits on Finance, Health and Human Services, State Affairs, and Transportation. Finally, Drew Springer, Republican of Munster, in his second term representing Senate District 30, previously served 4 terms in the House. This session, he's vice chair of both the administration and local government committees and serves on education, nominations, water, agriculture, and rural affairs. Give these guys a hand. Tell them how much you appreciate them being here. Thank you. I want to start out, Representative Harris, by talking about water infrastructure as one of the many issues that I think you all will tackle this session. There was an editorial in the Dallas Morning News in the last couple of days that noted that in 2022, Texas officials issued boil water notices roughly 3,000 times over the course of that year to alert residents that water in their distribution system was unsafe to drink. That's double the number in 2015, 4 times the number in 2008. What's going on here?
Well, Evan, I think, we've all heard the same lines of there's 1,100 people a day moving to the state of Texas, or over 1,000 people a day. We now have over 30 million people in the state of Texas. But not all those people are moving to rural areas, and we're seeing a lot of these issues in our rural areas with your smaller water supply corporations, the ones that are struggling to not only stay open, but can't even begin to maintain the infrastructure that was installed 50, 60 years ago. Right. So I think that's really where a lot of this critical issue is from, at least from my perspective in the rural districts, the rural parts of East Texas, is we have a lot of these water supply corporations who need help. They're trying the best they can, but they need help, and I think now is a good time for the state to make those investments in infrastructure.
Senator Springer, 9 of the 10, according to TCEQ, 9 of the 10 water entities that issued the most notices in 2022 were from either East Texas or from North Central Texas. These are rural communities. The largest community that had repeated boil water notices was Killeen, which is not actually very large, but 9 of the 10 were in rural communities. What Representative Harris says is true, right? These are communities that have just not invested any time recently to upgrade their facilities.
that's the biggest challenge they have. And part of the problem is water has been free for too long or too inexpensive, and raising those fees to make sure you're covering the additional cost in that infrastructure. You lay pipe down, it's there for 40 years, you didn't think about it, you didn't have money set aside, and all of a sudden, you've got 30-40% of your pipes are leaking. It's really expensive to come back in and start to fix those. And so there's that hesitancy to say that this is going to continue to be a priority. But we've done things in the legislature to try to address these on these small water systems. We've passed bills that says, that they have to have more financial disclosures to TCEQ. So we get a better sense that they're not having the money set aside to be able to address these issues.
Yeah.
We've done ones where a private system can go acquire another system and continue to have the rate they already have in place without having to go through a hearing, to where they can be able to invest and upgrade that water system that they take over. So we've done those. We continue to look at those things every legislative session.
Yeah. And Chairman Perry, just to note, there have already been, just in the first few weeks of this year, an average of 6 boil water notices a day across Texas. So where is the state in this conversation? What can and should the state do to address this issue in this session?
So I'll start with kind of a, you got me on? Can y'all hear me? So a broader conversation is, first of all, as elected officials, be it local, state, or federal,
Yeah.
the worst thing you can do is go tell your constituents you're going to raise a fee or a tax to cover infrastructure, because they turned their tap on yesterday and it worked fine.
Right.
And so we built this almost unmanageable problem with leaky infrastructure specifically. So there is a bill being drafted. It may be out by May 31st. We've got our ledge councils overwhelmed, to be truthful. They're facing the same workforce. But in that bill, what it's proposing is two things: a $2 billion state leverage fund, if you will, to go through the existing Texas Water Development Boards for mid-sized to rural communities to access through some low interest, no interest, and some match and some payback, evergreen kind of concepts built into those existing programs, to actually go out. Let me give you a number I've heard. 70% of our water infrastructure is currently at or over its estimated useful life.
70%?
70% is what the survey showed, and it's a $192 billion up to $392 billion problem. So $2 billion isn't going to turn the nut in a big way, but it might be the difference of a 3,000 connect system and under being able to leverage to go out and start addressing it. We currently fix our leaky pipes when one breaks. And there's some merit, I guess, to holding on to cash forever, but here's the deal. We've rode this horse as long as we can ride it.
Right.
We're a 30 million population. We run this infrastructure probably like we're 10 million. And we've never updated our FTEs. We've never updated our infrastructures. It's time to have the conversation. The 88 presents the first time in my legislative history, and I think from talking to everybody else, an opportunity to set the paradigm. To every session, you will have a water fund to go to if this legislation's passed, that will start a conversation about where are we at water. The other component of that fund is a whole new conversation about water supply development, period.
Right.
$1 billion goes to, and it's to leverage private sector technologies and ideas to develop new supplies.
Yeah.
Not move water around and call it a supply opportunity, because when you move water, you export the future of that community to a different one. And that's not how we should be operating as a state that has the wealth. So I'm looking forward to that. I think there's an appetite for water. For the first time I've been here, actually specifically water supply. People are engaged. The House caucus will bring that education. But the infrastructure issue is low-hanging fruit. It's about 140 million gallons of supply a year that goes back into the groundwater, and obviously it takes a while to get back there. So it's not like you've lost it all, but you're not getting efficient use of it.
So I want to come back and talk about this water fund idea, which I know you've been quite focused on, and also the opportunities presented by the budget. Let me go to Chairman King and note that while the boil water notices have been a problem, there are communities that would kill to have the problem of merely having to boil their water. I'm thinking about what happened last year, Chairman, in Odessa. In July, where you had 48 hours, you had 165,000 people who had no water at all, could not drink, could not bathe, could not flush toilets in the middle of a heat wave. And that was, again, because of a break in the aging water line. Even in a larger community, relatively speaking, like Odessa, this is a problem. This is really why you put the Water Caucus together, Chairman King. Is that not right?
It is, and there's several reasons that we did the Water Caucus. There's a lot of folks in the water communities have been urging us to put together a caucus to try and bring more awareness in the legislature to the issues that are out there. Not all of us on this dais, but a couple of us on this dais are getting a little long in the tooth, and so you want to make sure that people are interested. And I did want to say something about the boil water notices that I think is the TCEQ won't appreciate it too much, but there's no doubt that the boil water notices have increased, but I think it's important for people to understand that doesn't mean that there was necessarily a problem with the quality of that water, Evan. It just was a protocol that when you have a break in the line,
right,
or the pressurization or something like that you're required to flush those lines and boil the water and all that type of thing. And so while it is a huge issue, I don't want people to think that the water quality in the state of Texas has gone to pot.
You think there's an overregulation problem in the TCEQ case?
I think we can look at that. I think we might at some point look at that and see if that protocol is absolutely necessary in all instances. And I think, I don't know this, I haven't seen anything, but I just think it's something we ought to look at.
Well, in fact, I remember when the city of Houston or Harris County a few months ago had this problem, the very first thing that Mayor Turner said was, honestly, this is just basically a process that we have to follow. We don't believe there's really a risk to people here.
Well, we've gone through that, and I represent 6 counties, but one of the largest community is the city of Laredo,
yes.
And they had a similar issue. I mean, they've got some lines that were built for development, and they're pretty far out at the end of the system, and the development hadn't got there yet, so the water gets stagnant out there, theoretically.
Yeah.
I mean, we grew up drinking stagnant water, at least you and I did.
Out of the hose.
And so it's fine, but they're required to to flush them and boil the line and all that. So I think we can look at the protocols personally.
Yeah. Chairman King, let me stay with you and ask you about something you said when the Water Caucus was announced. You said water security is critically important to all Texans. By security, you mean access to it. Is that right? Is that what you mean by water security?
Yes. That's what I mean. Yes, Evan, that's exactly what I meant.
Yeah. Okay. Hadn't given it any thought until just now, did you? But I mean, we think about security in a lot of different ways, but in this case, it's the most basic sense of it that we just want to have, to Chairman Perry's point, turn on the tap, you have confidence that water is going to come out of it, right? Yeah. Usable water.
Yeah, so they want to be secure that there's water available, but there is an argument to be made that you want to make sure that your water supplies are secure from meddling by people.
Bad actors.
Bad actors too. We fortunately haven't had that in Texas, but I mean any community is vulnerable to that theoretically.
Right. And the fact is that, Senator Springer, as you know, there's an economic development aspect to everything that you all touch at the legislature, but water is no exception to that, surely. You know, the ag industry, you've got a lot of ag business in your district. The energy business in Texas, to name 2 significant contributors to the economy, also rely on the water security that Chairman King is talking about.
And water security isn't only just today when I turn on the tap.
Yeah.
If everybody in this room, when we buy a house, we think we may plan on possibly living there 30, 40, 50 years.
Yeah.
And and we see so much growth in Texas coming in, and people are, carving up old farmland and putting 2-acre lots, and they're drilling a well, and they're going down, and they're having to drop their well, go lower and lower and lower. But I've got a community I did in Millsap, Texas, that right now is getting told by somebody who says, we can't provide you water. They don't have access to groundwater. There's 400 houses that may almost become worthless if they can't find a solution to get there. So it's not only security today to know you have good, clean water, but it's knowing that in a community that's developed, as Senator Perry said, that you've got the ability on a long-term projection to know that there's going to be availability of water. Yeah. We can't guarantee that cost of that water today, and it may get more expensive.
Right.
As everything, as prices goes up, you use less of certain things, and I think we're going to see more and more of that in water going forward.
How much of this, Representative Harris, is about actions that you all can take to invest in rehabilitating or refurbishing outmoded systems, and how much of this is consumer behavior? What is the mix of that? Because I remember hearing some years ago that the city of San Antonio, just to pick one example, was overusing water. They really clamped down on conservation as a way to try to claw some of that water back, and they did a pretty good job of getting there. That's only one of many examples that we could point to. So how much of that is investment and how much of that is we all need to think differently about our use of water?
I think it's probably 50-50, but before I go on, I want to just go on the record and say that drinking out of a water hose did not die with y'all's generation.
It's still happening right now?
My boys still drink out of a water hose.
Okay,
Yeah,
good. Great.
Sorry.
Breaking news.
Yeah.
There's hope for this world.
But I think that's a great point. Water conservation, water in general doesn't sell headlines. That's not what really goes on our political mailers in a campaign or in a hotly contested primary. But unfortunately, it's something that it is such a critical issue to everybody across the state, whether they realize it or not. That's why the four of us are so passionate about water policy, because we recognize that conservation is a huge part of the equation, but so is the state taking the initiative to make those investments where they're needed. So I think it's both.
Same.
I did say 1 gallon saved today is 30 million gallons for use tomorrow.
Right. Cheapest water we have is the water we already have, right?
I would tell you that, and I'll use the example, I've talked to developers, $450 hot water recirculating pump in new development, new houses. How many of you guys got up today and you don't have one of those, and you turn your shower on to wait for it to heat up so you could get in it? You multiply that times 10 million households, 4 people in the household, in one day, you might meet the annual need of a lot of the cities in this Texas. So we've got to get smart about incentivizing, not mandating, talking to developers that are doing these new developments and looking at options. And then, Texas was hugely successful in the Don't Mess with Texas campaign. It's one of the nationwide programs you can point to from a PR perspective. We need a Don't Waste Water campaign, and we need to do it at the early levels in our school. And I know Staples, as ag commissioner a while back, had some things that the young kids were participating in. But we start pairing and the next governor of all that is, if you raise the cost, and Israel's a good example of that, when you get water high enough, people don't waste it. So there's some things coming, your water and your electricity is going to be higher in the future. We've enjoyed a lot of success in the designs that we got here, but we were way too cheap.
Yeah.
So we have some infrastructure stuff in this next session to work on, but you're going to pay more for all of that. But the education, the smart development opportunities, the awareness, those are all a component. And I don't know if it's 50% or not. I know, again, if you can save 1 gallon per person per day, and think about that, that's turning the water off your shower maybe 15 seconds earlier. It's just not a huge sacrifice to start adding supply back or keeping
But again,
supply.
important, incentivize, but don't mandate.
You don't mandate. I've found that just the sheer pushback on mandates, rightfully so, you lose more ground than you gain when you start having conversations, education, awareness, and kids, and then you give homeowners an incentive for reimbursement of that pump that the builder said it's $450 more. They're going to make that up in 1 year's water supply bill.
Clearly.
But it's the smart thing to do.
Chairman King, let me ask you about population, and then I want to quickly walk over to geography as conversation points on this subject. So we have 30 million Texans we know today, just over 30 by the revised estimates of the census. We know that according to the state demographer, the population of the state will grow by 17 million more between now and 2050. So we'll go to 47 million. We're going to add the equivalent of New Jersey's and Virginia's populations today to our own by 2050. Arguably, we don't have enough water for the people we have now, right? So how do you think about population change, growth of the state as it relates to water policy, things we need to be doing now to prepare for that moment?
Well, I think the first thing we need to recognize, and I would say that we probably do have enough water for the people in the state of Texas. We just use too much of it. I mean, there are industrial, developed countries and places in the world where they use a third the water that we do per capita.
So it's not about supply that's the problem right now. To Chairman Perry's point, it's about use.
Well, I think that's there's only two places in my view. I mean, we're not going to discover any huge new aquifer that we didn't know about.
Right.
And there's no hidden lakes out there that all of a sudden are going to show up. So, you're going to get the water for Texas in the next 50 years from conservation and from desalinization type things, which is, of course, extremely expensive.
Right.
But that's where the water is going to come from, and the low-hanging fruit in that is, of course, the brackish desal and the conservation efforts that you can do. But even in the U.S., I mean, there are places that use a lot less water than what we do here.
Do you think that on the latter point on the
But it's
desalination,
going to happen slowly. So I mean,
Right.
we're going to boil that frog pretty slowly.
should the legislature be playing more of a role in making some of that water that is currently not really usable or drinkable? Should you be focused on that, on desalination?
I think so.
Yeah.
I think so. And we have spent a lot of time on the two committees, Senator Perry and Representative Harris and I and Senator Springer, looking at trying to make the rules and regulations surrounding brackish water more amenable to these small desal opportunities.
Is that something, Senator Springer, that you should be taking up this session?
Look, it's a continuation. We did it when Senator Perry passed the map on mapping all the brackish
Right.
water and going through those, and it is a continuation. We will never solve the water situation to where the legislature isn't coming back in and continuing to look at what do we need to do to make sure water is available, and we're doing all the right things from there. But as Senator Perry said, the market starts fixing these as prices go up. People look at different things, whether it's the pump, whether now artificial turf that looks pretty nice and you don't have to mow it. And I'm sitting there going, God, all my kids have now graduated and moved out of the house. I got to start mowing again. Maybe I want to go to that turf.
Maybe
and
you
quit.
want to give up the
Maybe I
ghost
want
on
to
that,
quit
right.
watering it and spending so much watering St. Augustine that I don't get to eat.
Right.
And those are the things. And when those price points turn,
Yeah.
those decisions get made.
Is there a rural versus urban conversation, Representative Harris, in terms of the right solutions here? So much of the population over the next 30 years that I alluded to is going to be in the metropolitan counties. There are only 3 million people in rural Texas right now, about 10% of the population. And that percentage of the overall population will go down as the population grows in the urban areas. Do we need to be thinking about how we address this issue in the communities you represent versus the big cities going forward?
Absolutely. I just came off the House floor to come here, and Representative Goldman and I were having this very discussion at my desk. And Tarrant County and Dallas County are sitting on a literal ocean of brackish groundwater. And right now, the Tarrant County or Tarrant Regional Water Supply gets a lot of its water from Lake Palestine in my district, where I'm from. There's a pipeline where their East Texas water is going to Fort Worth. That's something that every governmental entity in my district is very aware of. Our water is not being used by our people; it's being shipped off to somewhere else. So if there are ways that we can prevent that and provide a source of potable, usable water that's readily available in those areas, I think we need to be pursuing that. And it's also, to me, the key to providing water to those populations in the future that you're talking about, the additional population growth. I think without investing in desalination projects and figuring out the code to break that equation, we're going to be in big trouble if we don't make that a priority.
Chairman Perry, we've talked a lot about the challenge for rural communities generally across a whole bunch of policy areas, the fact that the population in rural communities is so small. Often dollars follow people. You'd think that the legislature might be focused on, well, so much of the population is not in the rural communities. I want to see, and you want to see, rural get what it needs. This is a case where you got to be thinking about policies that are crafted specifically for those communities.
Right, and LightGov actually did a tour of 138 rural cities. And I wish he'd done it back in 11 because they're awesome people, and he figured that out through his tour. But he's got to focus on some rural initiatives that are long overdue.
Right.
Specifically, what I remind people is that my area, specifically the oil and gas in the South Plains, down to El Paso region, and then you go over to East Texas and you got the timber and some of that. We provide the food, fuel, and fiber, not only for Texas, but for the world and for this nation. And until Texas' economy is not as dependent from a production standpoint over those factors, it's a rural-urban issue, but for a different conversation, right? If you lose your rural livelihoods, if you don't have people out there to do those three things, Texas doesn't exist and doesn't look anything like it. I will add to the supply component. We do have an opportunity. So in that fund specifically, but you've got marine desal, you got brackish desal, you also have produced water desal. 14 million barrels of oil a day come up out of the ground in the Permian Basin, and that's on the low end.
So this is all part of your legislation.
And secondly, that we have states contiguous to us that have offered to sell us their water. And we've never, as a state, took that, I think, up at a level that deserves to be taken up. So in that supply development acquisition fund, whatever you want to call it, there's going to be opportunity to leverage those opportunities, because if we have anybody wanting to sell us water as a state that didn't take from an existing resource inside the state, we have to go there and get that done. We have to have a national conversation, and it's a different panel, but our country saw this. West of the Rockies, there needs to be some really hard conversations about desal and bringing it interior.
Right.
So there's a whole different water conversation that Texas will be a indirect benefactor of, but on the supply side, we've got the marine, the brackish, the produced, and then opportunity to acquire water from other states.
Yeah.
And we haven't seized that because we've had no vehicle, no process, no path, if you will, to have the conversation that we need to be having. Private sector with state leverage.
Right. Senator Springer, on the fiber portion of the food, fuel, and fiber piece, one of the things that we noted at the Tribune last year, we were not the only ones, that last year was a really bad year for the cotton industry. Read a bunch of stories that our reporter in Lubbock, Jamie Lozano, wrote, saying that the cotton production in the plains was decimated by drought and extreme heat, that High Plains farmers and other ag industries were on the hook to the tune of about $2 billion. It was a bad time. If for no other reason, we understand from an economic development standpoint, as we were talking about earlier, the importance of fixing this problem in communities like yours.
No, it absolutely is. And, you know, it's one of those things that I think it's a blessing for the Senate to come over, because you look at my old house, and for those who don't know, I had 22 counties and 25,000 square miles in the house. With redistricting, I have 11 counties, 4 of them being parcel and 9,000 square miles. I went from 160,000 people and a lot of great cotton farmers to now I have 1 million people that has 225,000 people in Frisco. But I still keep contact with those folks out there. It is. You know, it is challenging. It is the risk that they face. It's part of the challenges, and you know, God bless the farmers that wake up every day and say, I'm going to take a gamble and plant a crop and see how we go from here. But it was one of the reasons I was glad one of the bills we passed last session to have a study done out at Texas Tech on looking at produced water and how can we clean that up, not enough necessarily to be potable, but to be able to use potentially in agriculture, different type
Industrial use.
Industrial type of uses.
Yeah.
Watering golf courses. It doesn't need to be with potable water. And figuring out how we can do those things and utilize that resource asset versus just pumping it back down in the ground.
Yeah. Hey, Chairman King, can I ask you about, on the subject of drought? I look at the Water Development Water Weekly every week. I can't quit it. I can't help myself. And I know on that basis that we are in better shape than we were a year ago. We're only at about 55% drought conditions today. We were at 86% a year ago. Things are better. But if better is that more than half the state is in drought conditions, it's not exactly good. More than 3/4 of the state is abnormally dry right now. And even the big cities are facing this. It's not just the rural communities. Austin was about 10 inches short of the normal rainfall last year. It's the 5th driest year so far this century for the city of Austin. What do we do about drought? It's not something that we can control. So what do we do? How do we get out ahead of it? What do we do in a case like now when we're in the midst of it, from your perspective?
Well, of course, Evan, in your case, in regard to your ability not to stop reading that stuff, there are people you can talk to about that.
I can? No, I can't be fixed. I'm sorry. I love that stuff.
But in the case of the state of Texas, you know, all we can do is recognize that drought is a fact of life and that rainfall patterns have changed. We can argue all day long about why they're changing, you know, but the weather's been changing since the earth was formed. I mean, that's just a fact. And so, and just prepare and try to make sure that we get maximum use out of every dollar, out of every drop of water, and make sure that we prepare ahead of time. And, you know, there are many places on the face of this earth that people don't live anymore because the water ran out. And so, you know, I mean, we just have to face the reality of what we're looking at. But we need to make sure that we prepare carefully in the event that, you know, there's going to be another drought.
Right. You know, Representative Harris, Chairman Perry has said more than once that we have to be thinking not only about preserving the water we have, but also future water supply, that the focus has to be on both of those. The consequence of the drought, according to the Water Development Board's own hydrologist, is that we're tracking statewide about 10 percentage points lower than normal for water supply reservoirs right now. Like, it is really a conundrum, this question of future water supply. Drought's obviously going to make it harder for us to solve that problem, right?
Sure, absolutely. But I agree with Chairman King. We've got to accept that it's something we're going to have to deal with. This legislature is not going to figure out how to seed clouds and create rain,
Right.
to prevent
That's
a drought.
one thing you don't have at your disposal.
Correct,
Right.
exactly. But that's why I think we've got to be open to utilizing every tool in the toolbox, whether that's using private partnerships to look into the desalination projects with local municipalities, or produced water, you know, through the Produced Water Consortium that we've been working on. You know, we've got to look at everything, including, I would love to see the Department of Agriculture come back with that program on educating kids on the importance of conserving water. I mean, we've got to do everything in our power to prepare for that, or we're going to be in really bad shape.
Will the House be receptive to the legislation that Chairman Perry is referring to, this water fund, the idea of creating a water fund that could ultimately invest in this stuff? Is that your sense?
I think we should definitely look at it. Absolutely. Yeah. We're at a point where we need to sit down and discuss every option at the table. We're in a unique position in this legislature where we've got a huge surplus. Everybody's going after a piece of that pie.
Right.
But this deserves to be one of the priorities for the legislature.
Well, so I want to ask about that. So you and Representative Harris co-chaired the SWIFT Advisory Committee. We're now more than a decade out from the SWIFT. Do you pronounce the SWIFT a success based on how you thought about the funding mechanism to solve this problem the last time?
By any and all metrics, the SWIFT has exceeded my expectations, and I think people looking back, we had a goal of about $27 billion worth of projects, combined with private about 53, I think it is.
Yeah.
We've been there 10 years. We're at $9 billion or so.
And what did it cost the state? What did it cost
the
taxpayers?
state about $300 million, I believe is the estimate. We started with $2 billion. We're about 1.7. So in real dollars, the fund has been depleted by $300 million to leverage almost $9 billion or so in actual capital projects in the ground in this state today. So from the credit leverage, the buy down opportunities built in that, had some favorable interest rates for sure. So we kind of, you know, I'd rather be lucky than good. We kind of hit it and then we had Harvey that kind of expedited some other conversations about water. It brought water into the net. But by all accounts, that fund is way ahead of the curve where it needed to be. Here's the challenge with a water supply for all Texas, all zip codes. The SWIFT concept works for great municipals that have great resources, tax bases, and those things. Rural Texas is challenged because it has a smaller tax base, maybe depleting one, same issues though. So to do a SWIFT in the supply, maybe there's a component of this fund that we could have a conversation of, but you don't have the tax base if you don't figure out how to regionally connect all the dots.
So you're not talking about creating essentially another revolving loan
If
mechanism.
I was talking about a SWIFT concept, I would probably just modify the SWIFT rules to change. I don't know that that's a good policy or a bad policy, but I think you need to see physical leveraging with private sector of real dollars and opportunities to make this happen.
So Senator Springer, you know, I'm all for this creative financing mechanism, the idea that you're going to create a revolving loan fund, people are going to come to you with projects, you're going to give them the money, they're going to put their projects in the ground, ultimately money or most of the money is going to get paid back. You guys have more money than God right now. In this session, to Representative Harris's point, I mean, this is, if not now, when? I mean, I know that everybody is competing for a piece of this. I saw a graphic that you tweeted after the Senate introduced its draft budget with a whole long list of things, and good on you for, we're going to do this and we're going to spend money on this. By the way, water was not mentioned on that whole long list of things. I mean, I'm wondering, how are you all going to compete for those dollars? Let me ask Senator Springer.
I mean, look, I mean, everybody is in the mix, and yes, when we produce lists, sometimes different ones don't fall on, but it's not to say that water is not going to be on the final list. Of there. It's why I don't think you've heard anybody on either side of either party sit here and says, we're either going to spend every single dollar or we're going to give every single dollar back, because we took it from the taxpayers, we could give it all back. Right. And we said we're going to give a portion of it back, a healthy portion. Right. But we've all said we have issues we need to take care of, whether it's water, whether it's raising wages in some of our agencies to where we can fill empty slots because we can't attract people. It will play in that mix of where we come up to. But to the programs that are being discussed, we've got to figure out where are these areas that are most in need, that have the ability to be able to really tackle the issues that we don't have the waste. By the way, I'll just say, because I must be the big water guy because I have my Upper Trinity water socks on.
Right.
I was wondering about those.
Noted. Very good.
I had some weird looks out there, so I figured I'd better.
The amount of money for your water fund, top line.
$2 billion to infrastructure and $1 billion for the
So call it three.
Here's the thing: that baseline budget. What you got to know is we have spending caps, correct?
Right, of course.
And that's a good thing. Right. All of these initiatives we're talking about would be a constitutionally dedicated fund outside of the budget to remove it from the spending cap, not because we're fiscally responsible, but I think it's a big enough initiative that Texans ought to get to vote on this. They came out and voted for SWIFT because they saw the need. This is one of those things taxpayers expect us to do.
So the expectation here would be that you would put something in front of the legislature first and then the voters, and then we would have to approve it. Right.
Exactly.
At election time.
So you get some of the things, so that baseline didn't need to include these big infrastructure initiatives because we had spent the cap day one, and they'll be outside for constitutional amendment, and it puts something in permanent conversation going forward. It's not a one-time, one-off budget item. You get to set up something that has some perpetual nature to it, and I think that's critical in this kind of conversation.
Chairman King, it'd be hard to argue with as much money as you have available that this is not something that you ought to be doing. You may never have the opportunity to do this again or to be as ambitious as you can be as a consequence of this surplus, right?
You're absolutely correct. And candidly, the folks, all of them are in this room, that pushed the development of the Water Caucus over the last few years. That's exactly one of the main reasons that they thought that we needed to, and one of the main reasons they leaned on me to go ahead and get this thing going was because this is the time to do this if we're going to do it.
Yeah. And are you comfortable with what Chairman Perry just outlined, taking this to the voters and having this be dedicated and outside the budget?
Yes.
That's how you'd prefer to do it?
I'm sorry, can you repeat that?
That's how you would prefer to do it? You would
Yes.
prefer to do it that way, rather than just making it part of a line item in the budget? Okay.
I think that's more sustainable.
Very good. Okay, so we're at about 20 of the hour, and I wanted to be sure that we brought some of you all into the conversation. So do we have a microphone that will go around? We have 2 microphones that we're going to walk around. Before we go to you all, though, get ready for your questions. Is there anything that we're not aware of in the area of water legislation in either the House or the Senate that you want to let us know about that you think is coming, that you think ought to be a priority? Representative Harris?
No specifically to that, but I do want to point out, you asked with the laundry list of issues that are a priority for the budget, how are we going to accomplish this in water? Speaking on behalf of the House, I know Chairman King will agree with this, the speaker's made it very clear that this is a priority for him. Infrastructure and water issues in general are very near and dear to his heart.
Yeah.
If that's a priority of our speaker, you can guarantee that's going to make it to the front of the line as we move forward in this discussion.
Yeah. I mean, Senator Springer, I guess we haven't brought this up, but the federal government, through the infrastructure bill that passed, has money, if I'm not mistaken, dedicated for just this very purpose.
Right, about $2.5 billion if I'm
That might
not
be
mistaken.
a case where we might not look away from the federal government. We might say, well,
Absolutely.
We,
No.
we might be willing to leverage those dollars, access
Look, I
those
mean,
dollars.
I believe in 4 core functions of government, and one of those big ones is infrastructure. That's what government is supposed to do. So
Right.
our tax dollars that came from Texans, whether it went to the federal government or to Texas, to be able to use tax dollars to do infrastructure is what we should be doing.
Take our dollars back. All right. Questions in the room. There's one in the very far back, there's one right here, and there's one right here. Let's be sure we bring somebody back to you in a second. Okay. Sir.
Okay. This is primarily for Chairman Perry, but others may want to respond. Most of your discussion this morning has been about water supply, responding to drought, but I know, Chairman Perry, you've been a leader on flood management issues the last several sessions. Does your fund envision more money for the flood management aspect of water, or how do you see the coming session as addressing the need for additional funding for flood control?
Great question. Flood management.
So Chairman Creighton, coming from that Harvey area, has already told me he's asking for additional money for our depleted Harvey relief funds. There was 3 buckets of money, I believe it was. We put them to good use. We've got good things moving. So there will be more money. I don't know what the number looks like. He's like me and everybody else. We're asking for billions. Where it goes in that. So I know that we're planning on funding, and I think Water Development Board showed me an LAR that had $375 million back into the Harvey relief aspect to continue the flood mitigation plans that we started from 17's Harvey event. So yes, on flood. On the management in general, I'll just go to real quickly. Management at a local level, our water supplies, we are just like everybody else. There's no expertise to run those plants, those actual supply systems. So we're trying to figure out how to dovetail with high school as well as junior colleges and get certification out a little quicker to where you're kind of training from within. And the guy that's been there 65 years that's long in the tooth that won't be there, but that supply demands somebody that knows what they're doing to turn the chlorine off or off when it needs to be. We don't have that workforce coming up through the ranks. So we're looking at, from a management perspective, I'm kind of excited. We had a school district that owned the supply in my district. They ended up with the well system for the entire community. They started a program in their high school so there would people be trained to run the supply system. So we've taken that model to workforce and trying to see what we can do with that. But we have a workforce shortage in our water supply management too. So we're looking at it from a lot of levels. I'm excited about where that could go.
Good. One in the back, one over here. Let's go here and then right to the back. Sir.
Yeah, thanks so much for attending our event. Michael Bloom from the Houston area with American Society of Civil Engineers is my volunteer job, but wanted to ask more about the flooding. A lot of, Senator Perry, you responded with regard to Harvey recovery sort of after the disaster, but the legislature last session passed amazing work in Senate Bill 7 and 8 for the flood planning process that the board's doing. We're, about to deliver the first statewide flood plan ever to reduce the risk, right, before the disaster. So right now, my understanding is that the project money is almost spent, and the planning money is almost almost spent. There are counties and areas of the state that don't even know what the flood risk is because they don't have maps. So is there any hope that we could, in the 88th, get some additional funding for that mitigation and mapping and planning?
I just answered the project aspect. I think there's 375 in the baseline LAR. The actual planning and stuff, I would assume majority of that's been done based on the plan that's fixing to be delivered or is delivered shortly. So I don't know how much more planning there is, but I'm assuming if you're in an area that hasn't done the planning as part of the Harvey Relief Initiative, then obviously you would need that planning money. So I don't have the buckets in my mind on what's left and what's not. I will tell you, there's a Water Development Board display out here that shows some interactive maps that were pretty impressive on projecting what happens in an event. And you can put in different variables and show the damage economic. They've got it tied to property tax values and tell you this wipes out X number of millions of dollars. So, and then the second side of that, I'm talking to some national people on that front. If Texas is leading the way in watershed flood mitigation and some of those initiatives, we got to get credit on our insurance policies. And there's some cost recovery opportunities there if we get this right, and I think we are, that we need to go back and explore. And FEMA maybe can tag into some of our resources and make it a better process for around the country. But I think there's opportunity for some cost recovery. To your point, there's additional money coming. If it's going to be specific to planning or projects or how they divvy that up internally, I can't speak to specific allocation.
Got it. Yes.
Thank you so much. Thank you for a great panel. I just have a question for you. You mentioned considering bringing water from other states. And I was wondering if there are any thoughts going into the potential long-term unintended consequences of that state wanting their water at some point, and conflicts between the source water and the place that grows based on demand on that water. I'm from California, and we are experiencing that with the Colorado River, and I think this is a great example. If you go up and down the country, everybody who's doing this. So I'm just wondering if there is any discussions around that.
So I don't have the Latin term for seller beware. I personally would never encourage Texas to sell its water. But I will tell you there is opportunity to contiguous states that see flooding fairly regularly that wipe out entire cities that the country ends up going and rebuilding every year. So there is predictability in that. I do believe that they would be smart enough to tell us X number of acre feet is available, and we would go with that. Obviously, if they got into a situation where that was no longer needed, or they couldn't do that supply, there would be a contract in place that they'd have to fulfill some way or another, or reimburse, I guess. But I'm not having the pause on taking water from other states that believe in their estimates they have water to supply us. So that's not Texas's problem. Where we have an issue is we've never taken advantage of those conversations.
Okay. Other questions in the room for these four? Got one back there. Ma'am.
I know I sat all the way in the back, so I wanted to meet you there. I wanted to take a minute and ask you about impoverished communities and folks without means. When we talk about flood and we talk about drought, we also have to talk about the people who are affected, right? So for the smaller water corporations and supply companies that are losing water through their infrastructure, but don't have the means to repair those infrastructures, and then also for folks who are flooded repetitively or who have been flooded outside a special flood hazard area, who need assistance with flood insurance policies. Has the legislature considered dedicating resources to these types of communities and to these types of homeowners and residents who may need assistance now that we have some extra funds sitting around?
Chairman Springer, Representative Harris, what do you think about that?
We've done some work, once again, I think it was a constitutional amendment, we did EDAP, that helped those impoverished communities to be able to reach out and do those throughout the state, and that was an effort that the entire legislature put on, again, it was last session, and so when we worked on that. But, we've got to continue to go down through those. You mentioned, the supplies, the private suppliers that don't have the resources to do it. They don't have the resources because they're not charging what it costs to do it, and you can question, whether you have to be there. I remember when I was a rep and we were in Rawls, Texas, and we were talking to them, and they said, well, we can't do that because it's going to cost everybody $10 more a month. Senator Perry goes, well, what does it cost you if you don't have water?
What's the cost of not doing it?
Not having any water. And again, that means your house is worthless. And so you may not like to pay $10 more a month, but because the problem is you've done it for 20 years. That's my water bill. My water bill is always $15. I can't pay $25. It's a fact of life that it's become a more scarce resource.
Yep.
One area that we're talking right now about that kind of fits in line with that, the Flood Infrastructure Fund is delineated on boundaries and kind of around MSAs. And it doesn't take into account some of those outlying more rural areas that should qualify in that fifth fund. And we're talking about right now going and redrawing those boundaries to take in those outlying areas that are the more impoverished areas in an MSA, but they still should count in this to be able to mitigate some of the flooding that goes on.
I would just add that the supply fund, if it comes through, is specifically targeted to Texas Water Development Board to help some of those smaller rural connects. That's kind of where it's going to. Additionally, we have on the FEMA insurance and all those conversations, if we get our flood mitigation plan right, maybe they're not getting as flooded. They're not going to buy homeowners insurance. These are people that are living paycheck to paycheck or no paycheck. So I think there's access in the current Water Development Fund for supply systems and mitigation opportunities that they could probably access. So there's a lot of buckets of money. It's complicated, and Water Development Board has resources and does a great job of walking people through that. And I would encourage you to get on that.
Good. Back there. Yes.
Thank you all so much for being here. Is this on? Okay, there we go. My name is Danielle Goshen. I'm with National Wildlife Federation. And my question is for Senator Perry. The Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act was brought up, and the $2.5 billion that is available to Texas for the state revolving funds. However, we didn't specifically talk about the drawdown funds that are necessary in order for us to tap into those. Will it be a priority through the appropriations bill to put up the local match for that, the $125 million, I think it is, in order to draw down those federal funds?
So we're obligated to put up $125 million to get access to the 2.5?
I think that's correct. I don't think the 2.5 is the number that we're actually going to pull down. I think we looked at the 2.5 and there was aspects of it that didn't address Texas the way Texas wanted to be addressed, but we are pulling down, and I'm looking at Chairman Pop over there. She's shaking her head yes. So I want to clarify. Yes. So we do have some exceptional item, meaning it's outside the baseline, but they're going to come to us and ask for it more to do some of that local match. But that bucket of money, if you will, doesn't fit Texas.
So you're just so I'm clear, because there was some discussion at the time that this bill and maybe one of the other federal bills was introduced that we might decline to access those funds out of concern for what strings might be attached to those dollars. So this is a case where there's $2.5 billion potentially available for us to take from the federal government, our tax dollars, to Senator Springer's point, but we're going to say no to it?
Well, you know, $2.5 billion is what we get today, but it cost us $10 billion over the next 10 years. I'm not sure that was the bargain we were hoping for, but there is money coming through that we are taking in and do fit the existing Water Development Board programs so that we don't create a whole new regimen of bureaucracy and rules and promulgation and 3 years down the road to implement money, which is really the cool thing about some of the things we're talking about today. You could plug in the check today, pending people getting engaged and getting their applications in and approved, they could have money. Yep. So that's part of the problem with government, and I understand why it has to move this way. These are things that can be done pretty short order.
Yeah, even though our tax dollars are the dollars we're talking about, they'll go to another state, presumably, if we don't take them.
Well, it's just that old political football. You know, some things have strings that you can't accept and some things don't.
Other stuff for these folks before we wrap. Back there, yes. Hi.
Hello. Good afternoon. Thank you so much for this panel and for your passion in bringing this a very important issue here today. I'm a civil engineer. My name is Mia Parton. And for the first time in my career, I start to see a lot of moratoriums that are happening on suburbia and rural areas where development is on hold or permitting is not moving forward with subdivisions and development for housing, which obviously is a big concern on the affordability side of things for affordable housing and ability to handle the demand of this population. The main reason that we ask, why is there a moratorium, what's going on, you know, talking to council and cities, and they're saying that the water supply is not adequate, or we need to do a study and investigate if we can handle this subdivision that's coming into our area. So what is the legislature doing about this issue as far as raising the rates and the fees on the water bills? But at the same time, we're also having issues affording to live in houses due to slowdown in development or not having water to actually build.
I'm glad.
You're suburban, so I'll sit there and talk about the area I have, and you can go look at Parker County. I grew up in Weatherford, Texas, and it's sort of right on the cusp of you have water if you're on the east side of the county, you don't have water if you're on the west side of the county. And so a developer sits out there and looks at this big old huge horse farm, cow farm, and sits there and says, man, I could build 1,000 houses out there. They don't realize the reason that there's only cows out there is because there's never any water to drill.
Because they can't build.
And so they go, well, I got it platted, I want to build it, but we turn to our groundwater districts that we charge them with finding out and approving, can you be able to do that? They've gone from 1 acre to 2 acres. They're talking about going to 5 acres to build a lot in certain areas simply because the water source isn't there. And that gets back to the original one that Chairman King said. That is what water security is. And we charge those groundwater districts, the commissioner's courts that's approving those plats, to be able to say, do you really think that there's going to be water there for the long term?
And right now, it's a buyer's beware market in the development area. There's a development up in my neck of the woods that 2,500 home development with no guarantee of water underneath it, but no requirement that that guarantee was made or delivered. If I'm in the mortgage industry and I have 30-year mortgages, I think at some point this is going to be a conversation at that level.
Yeah.
So to your point, it's not as much about raising fees to cover the cost of new water supply. The first question is there water supply to develop?
To begin with, right. So we're at about 2 minutes before the hour. We want to do one last very quick one, please, before we have time, Lauren? Okay, last one, very quick.
Just real quick here. Thank you all for your service. There are a lot of water champions and advocates in this room. What can we do to help you today to accomplish this mission to achieve more funding? What is our goal leaving here today?
Chairman King, let me ask you to take that one. So the questioner is asking, what can they do to help you as we get into this session?
I think you can, when you have the opportunity to visit with the public, just to let them know that water is a long planning effort, to let them know just what we were talking about a minute ago, that you don't have to develop a piece of property just because it's pretty if there's no water. And I will add on that, by the way, we do need to pay attention to that, because in my part of the world along the border, we've seen what happens. Even though, originally when some of those communities and colonias were developed, they didn't have any real resources, we said, well, it's buyer beware. And that was easy until there's 4,000 people living down there in those conditions, and then all of a sudden, in spite, whether you want to or not, it becomes our problem. And so it's better to stop that up front. But I think just building awareness, and to the extent when the times come, when people are raising Cain about the price of a water bill and increases and those types of things, I think it's important that the public understands that there is a cost to water, and it's going to start costing more. And that's going to be the main driver of conservation down the road. And that's a hard conversation to have, but to the extent that those of you in this room can help us do that, that'd be good.
I'd just add, this only happens if the water community knocks on the statewide doors. I mean, I'm talking from governor, light gov, speaker, comptroller, and ag commissioner. Comptroller and ag commissioner have become the water people of the state some way or another, but I'm just telling you, it's time to put some feet to the talk. It's time to have a real conversation about where Texas is going, where it wants to be, and let this miracle continue. I will tell you, my personal observation is the lack of urgency around the discussion about water supply will be the Achilles heel of this state, but not only this state, this country, in a large part of the areas that we all love and dear and go to, west of Rockies. But y'all, we got SWIFT done, really, in 11 after a severe drought, during a severe drought, but we got it done because there was an awareness, but there was a lot of advocacy. I wish I had a bill number to quote you. I don't know that my bill's not going to change significantly. It has what I've been told by Leg Council, opportunities to fill in the blanks, if you will. I don't know how I feel about that, but it was really a piece that I meant to have a lot of interaction with. So you guys got to get out there and beat the bushes on this when you get something to talk about. And what it looks like in its final stage, I am all confident we will be better for water supply development than we were when we started.
It's a good note to end on. Please acknowledge and thank Chairman Perry, Chairman King, Representative Harris, Senator Springer. Thank you, Water Development Board. All right, good. Thank you.